So it's been almost a year now, and the narrative has changed a few times. At the very beginning, it was Putin just woke up one day, and remember, Putin is the only person in Russia, and he just felt like going nuts. He went crazy and did a Hitler and just started attacking everyone. So that was the narrative at the start, and that lasted about 2 days before it fell apart. And then the narrative changed to Putin is an imperialist. This is Russian irredentism. The only time half of these people will even use that word, irredentism. What's the other one? Revanchism, yeah. So this is the only time, the only context that all these people have even used these two words. And there's no coincidence there either. And that narrative of Tsar Putin, the next Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, has decided to just restore the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and is starting with Ukraine, and he's going to take over all of Europe. And that lasted probably most of a year, and it's starting to fall apart now, and the next layer is having to take over and do the heavy lifting, and that is NATO and Russia are locked in a war, and we must win. We must defeat Russia. Took long enough. So let's get into this, because some of these statements have started to come out over the past few months. So they held rank for most of a year, but now it's starting to leak through, and we're seeing a bit more of what's going on behind the scenes. A lot of us knew this was all actually what was going on a year ago, and said as much. Like, we called this, a lot of us have been expecting every single bit of this to come out. So this is what I'm talking about here. I'll go through all this. A lot of us have been sitting waiting for this. I, for one, was waiting for this. I knew this bullshit was going on, and I was waiting. This is the one I was actually waiting on to make this video, and I've been adding to this, waiting for this to come out, and it came out a few days ago, about a week ago, so I'm going to get around to this. But first, let's go into the bit of the background. I'll start with this up here. NATO decided that it is necessary to continue to smash Putin and not to negotiate. They broke off the negotiations, and then it seemed to me that they were wrong. That's the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, and that was about a week ago. So, in the lead up to this, in the lead up to February 2022, we had 8 years of Ukrainian shelling of its own ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking civilians in Donbass has ensued. Diplomatic efforts, the Minsk Protocol of 2014 for one, have been attempted and repeatedly failed to prevent the fighting, shelling. The Minsk II agreements 2015 were the final framework and likewise have failed. So this was the collaborative international effort to bring peace to Ukraine, because of course they've been locked in a civil war since the coup in 2014. So that's the backstory to all this. In August of 2021, there was a withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan. The military-industrial complex now has no locus, because of course the US always has to have a war going on at all times. That has to be the status quo, because quotas have to be filled, checks have to be cashed, the military-industrial complex has to keep chugging on, the gears have to keep spinning, and if that's not happening, America's in trouble. So after the US pulled out of Afghanistan, you just knew there was going to have to be another war opened up, another front, another money black hole that could be getting funneled into. So we found that in Ukraine, ostensibly. Russia issues ultimatum on December the 17th, 2021. Russia issues list of demands it says must be met to lower tensions in Europe. That was in late 2021. Contentious security guarantees Moscow is seeking include a ban on Ukraine from entering NATO. So that was in December. They once again reiterated their bright red line about NATO, and nothing came from the West. So that was Russia making clear its security concerns, for better or worse. Then, in February the 19th of 2022, sudden massive surge in bombing of civilians in Donbass causes Russia to raise a final cry out to the West on February 19th, 2022. Russia voices alarm over sharp increase of Donbass shelling. That was about a week before the invasion. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov voiced alarm on Friday over a sharp increase in shelling in East Ukraine and accused the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission of glossing over what he said were Ukrainian violations of the peace process. The peace process, February 18th. And by that point they've already got loads of equipment and soldiers up against Ukraine's border. Then, on the 21st of February, Russia recognises that the LPR and DPR breakaway republics are no longer part of Ukraine on February 21st. And then on February 22nd, Russia openly abandons all hope of resolution being found in the Minsk agreements on February the 22nd. Putin says Minsk Accords, which were meant to end war in eastern Ukraine, no longer exist. The Minsk agreements do not exist now, he said. And I've got a video of that. I'll just show this before I get into what I'm here for.
Минские договоренности, они были убиты еще задолго до вчерашнего признания. Были убиты еще.
Putin has said the Minsk agreements were killed long before the recognition of the People's Republics of Donbass, and not by Russia, not by representatives of these republics, but by the current Kiev authorities. The Russian president has stated that within the borders will Russia recognize these republics, but they have recognized them, which means they have recognized their fundamental documents, including the Constitution. And the Constitution spells out the borders within the Donetsk and Luhansk regions when they were part of Ukraine. But Russia expects, and Putin wants to emphasize, is that all controversial issues will be resolved during the negotiations between the Kiev authorities and the leadership of the two republics. He has added, regarding the use of armed forces abroad, Russia has signed agreements on Tuesday, and in these agreements, both with the Donetsk People's Republic and with the Luhansk People's Republic, there are corresponding paragraphs that say Russian government will provide these republics with appropriate military assistance. Regarding the conflict there, with this decision, Russia has made it clear that if necessary, they intend to fulfill their obligations. Putin has also mentioned that the most important point is the known degree of demilitarization of today's Ukraine, since this is the only objectively controlled factor that can be observed and reacted to. Everything else flips from today to tomorrow in either direction.
Alright, we found subtitles, more or less. That'll do. So, the Minsk agreements were dead long before they did that. So they gave up on the Minsk agreements, and then in response they recognised the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic as sovereign breakaways. If the armed forces of Ukraine receives an order to withdraw heavy weapons and artillery from the front lines and set the ceasefire regime, the Right Sector Volunteer Corps reserves the right to continue military actions in accordance with its own operative plans until complete liberation of Ukrainian territories. That was Dmytro Yarosh, the leader of the Ukrainian Right Sector, who were also instrumental in the 2014 coup that was led by fascists. They provided the muscle, they did all of the dirty work, they stormed the government buildings, they were instrumental in having that violent coup succeed. So the Minsk II agreements, the only hope of an agreed peaceful solution to the Ukraine civil war, were a knowing sham, a bad faith ploy to instead buy time to prepare for an inevitable and desired war with Russia. China Foreign Minister says the Minsk agreements are the only way out on Ukraine. That was in February, so the Chinese were still apparently trying. Said Ukraine should not be a front line for competition among major powers, which is how China regards this. They see this as a geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the US. So now we get into it. The cause for this video, after nearly 10 minutes. Merkel reveals the Minsk agreement was a stalling tactic that allowed the West to militarise Ukraine as an anti-Russia proxy and fortify it for an inevitable war. I'm struggling to find any coverage or analysis of this remarkable confession in English language mainstream media. Of course, that's because it completely flies in the face of all of the required narratives to maintain the status quo. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in an interview with the German newspaper Die Zeit, the 2014 Minsk agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time. They used that time to get stronger, which you can see today. Ukraine of 2014-15 is not Ukraine of today. Like us, if we could see fighting near Debaltsevo in 2015, Russia could easily have won then, and I very much doubt the NATO countries could have done as much for Ukraine then as they're doing now. We all knew that. That the conflict was frozen, that the problem was not resolved, but that is exactly what bought Ukraine valuable time. Can anyone tell me how can Russia ever trust the West again? How can they ever commit to a possible future peace agreement? I would say they can't. Yeah, and this is the problem. Diplomacy requires trust as an essential component. If trust is gone, no agreement that requires trust can happen, and of course all agreements rely on trust. I'll do this, you'll do that. Hollande's remarks on Minsk Accords prove West was lying, a French politician. He stressed that such incredible revelations may have quite tangible consequences, such as the conflict's escalation. Paris, December 31st. Ex-French President François Hollande's admission that the Minsk Accords were used to give Kiev and Western countries a break and beef up the Ukrainian army only confirms assertions by the Russian leadership on the West's dishonesty and undermines its global reputation. Leader of France's Popular Republican Union, François Asselineau, told a TASS correspondent, "For Hollande, it was strange to make such a statement because it presents Western countries as liars, and therefore nobody can trust them." And this adds weight to Putin's remarks when he was talking about the empire of lies as represented by the West, the politician said. He stressed that such incredible revelations may have quite tangible consequences, such as the conflict's escalation. Asselineau reiterated the West's unkempt promise not to expand NATO eastward. In reality, since 1989, the US and NATO have been waging a war against Russia, and it is underway to this day, the politician said. According to him, the current conflict will decide the fate of the future world order, whether it will be led by the West under Washington's guidance, or the diversity of civilizations and nations with the multinational order will prevail. Personally, I am confident that the aspiration for the freedom and diversity of countries corresponds to what Russia, together with China, are defending, he said, adding that he was viewing the state of Western countries as increasingly difficult. More countries began to dislike the West, while our economic situation is getting worse over economic sanctions against Russia, which played against us, the French politician emphasised. So that is now François Hollande and Angela Merkel, the leader of France and Germany respectively at the time of the Minsk Accords were being decided and attempted to be implemented, have both acknowledged openly that they were a sham, that they were a duplicitous ploy to take advantage of Russian diplomatic willingness. It's really bad, really damning. Real attention behind Minsk agreements further destroys credibility of the West. From pushing for the Minsk agreements to inciting the ongoing conflict between Moscow and Kiev, the West is attempting to exhaust and contain a country which they deem as a rival through protraction efforts, be they explicit or inexplicit. It has never really genuinely regarded Russia as a dialogue partner. In an interview with the German newspaper Die Zeit last week, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel revealed the West's real intention behind its negotiation with Russia and Ukraine to promote a ceasefire in 2014. She admitted the Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine time and that Kiev had used it to become stronger. In response, Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday that Merkel's remarks were completely unexpected and disappointing. As the US media and New York Post pointed out, Putin felt betrayed by the West following the Minsk agreements. It has turned out that no one was going to implement the agreements, the Russian leader pointed out. It has turned out that no one was going to implement the agreements. Even if you're just a neutral observer of a war, you have to just be angry at this. Do you not? Isn't it the duty of any decent person, any humanitarian, to just be disgusted at this? The purpose of these agreements was to avoid further bloodshed of civilians especially, and escalation. and they were completely bad faith and never had a hope in hell of succeeding. That's even worse than just letting things lie as they are. To actually pretend to want peace while wanting more war, that's worse than doing nothing. But that's what the West did. The Minsk agreements intended to manage the Ukraine crisis and avoid escalating the conflict. Merkel actually confessed something Western politicians do not want to admit about the Minsk agreements. They were just a stopgap to buy time for Ukraine and the West, and Western countries have never put real effort into resolving the differences with Russia over the Ukraine crisis. And of course, NATO has been training the Ukrainian military 1 battalion at a time. I think it's every week another 500 soldiers graduated from NATO military programs and were ready to go to war with Russia or otherwise to just invade Donbass, which they've been shelling for 8 years. 9 years now. What the former German leader stated tears down the last remaining bit of the friendly mask some Western countries put on with Russia. In the eyes of some Western countries, Russia is just a diplomatic and political alien. Moreover, under the influence of Washington, some view Moscow as a so-called threat due to its huge military power and political system that does not meet the Western standard. As a result, these countries have never stopped suppressing Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Russia has always considered itself a European country, expecting to build trust with the West. Thus, it's understandable when Putin expressed disappointment and a sense of betrayal from Merkel's words. Yep, and see, to me, whenever I listen to interviews with Putin, I would hear him use this phrase over and over again, our partners. He kept saying our partners, and I used to think, who is he talking about? Is he talking about some Russian political elite? Like, is it some cabal in Russia? But he was actually talking about the US and the UK and France and Germany, our partners. He kept using it for years, and I remember I thought that was always strange, and then I remember reading something, it was an Oliver Stone interview, I think it was with Lex Friedman, where Oliver Stone actually, he just hits this on the head. He says, I kept hearing Putin use the phrase our partners, and I had to tell Putin, they're not your partners, they're not your friends. So Oliver Stone had to update Putin's perception of the West, it seemed like, which was just shocking to me. It was strange to me to think that I was on to the West before even Putin was. It's just bizarre. That's taking what Putin was saying at face value, but every time he said our partners, I just thought, what the fuck? Every time I've seen Russia in the media in the West, it's always something bad. It's never good. They are our enemies. It's just like Iran or China. There's nothing good to say about these countries, these powers. It's always bad. You always be suspicious of them. You always wait for them to do something horrible and have it be in the news. So yeah, I always thought that was strange. And this just shows the disconnect. It's completely one way. Russia's trust in the West has already fallen to a new low, and the West's hypocrisy has worn out Moscow's will to engage in an effective dialogue with the West, some experts noted. Now there's a question of trust on the agenda, and it's already close to zero, said Putin on Friday. Yeah, of course. Can you blame them at all? What is that a surprise? The agreement the US wants is never about credibility. It is all about interests. An agreement is seen as useful by the US when it can advance the country's interests, otherwise Washington is always ready to deny it. This is exemplified by US's withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Yeah, this was a big thing. And the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Washington also adopts a double standard to advance its allies' interests when carrying out the agreement. The US and several other Western countries have become defaulters in the international community. They dare to break their promises because they are protected by the Western hegemony with the US at its core. Washington has already hijacked many other Western countries to join such a hegemony, creating and maintaining a distorted international order. It is anticipated that some US-led Western countries will keep using so-called values as an excuse to defend their collective hegemony and bully others under international rule and order in their favour. As long as such domination exists, the world will still be the victim of power politics rather than a place full of justice and fairness. So that's France and Germany. France and Germany were guarantors of this peace deal and essential security framework for Europe. Instead of facilitating this peace, they prepared for horrific war years in advance. Ukrainian leaders anticipated and expected this. And then here we have Zelensky's advisor, Alexei Arestovich, confirms that a full-scale war with Russia was pre-planned and desired by the Ukrainian regime for the purpose of joining NATO as far back as 2019, when this interview was conducted.
Если Украина получает выдачу в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем.
No, we won't speak about any dates of termination of war. Quite the opposite. It will most likely prompt Russia to launch a large-scale military operation against Ukraine, because they'll have to degrade us in terms of infrastructure and turn everything here into devastated territory so that NATO would recruit. Fuck's sake, Elon. Most likely prompt Russia to launch a large-scale military operation against Ukraine because they'll have to degrade us in terms of infrastructure and to turn everything here into a devastated territory so that the NATO would be reluctant in accepting us. Do you mean that Russia will dare to directly confront NATO? Of course, Russia is no, not NATO. They must do this before we join NATO to make us not interesting for NATO, so that we become uninteresting as a havoc territory with a probability of 99.9%. Our price for joining NATO is a big war with Russia, and if we do not join NATO, it's reabsorption by Russia within 10 to 12 years. Here's the fork we're facing now. And now let's make a choice, unclear. But wait, if we put on the scales what's better in this case. Of course, large-scale war with Russia and joining NATO as a result of defeat of Russia, the coolest thing. And what can a large-scale war with Russia look like? Well, it's air offensive invasion of 4 Russian armies they created on our borders. Siege of Kiev, attempt to encircle the troops deployed in the ATO zone. An anti-terrorist operation zone in Donbass, breakthrough of the isthmus of advancement towards the reservoir to give water to Crimea, offensive from the territory of Belarus, establishing new people's republics, sabotage activities, strikes against critical infrastructure facilities and so on. Airborne invasion, that's what is full-scale war, and its probability is 99%. When? 2020 after 2020, 2021 to 22, 2020 to 2022 are the most critical. So he's anticipating everything that happened here, it looks like. So he's describing the forcing through of joining NATO as necessitating either actually successfully being in NATO or a full-scale war with Russia, which he elaborates on the details on as if he's quite familiar with the possibility and what it would entail. So that was in 2019 when he described that. So he describes Ukraine as having been in the process of taking actions that would ultimately lead to a conflict with Russia. That was 2019. So they expected the war as well, the Ukrainian political elite. I think that guy was an advisor, a senior advisor to Zelensky. European leaders perfidiously betrayed the innocent people of Donbass and stabbed Russia in the back. They destroyed all trust, without which diplomacy is impossible and without which any resultant war necessarily would go all the way. In June of 2022, former President Poroshenko said, "We had achieved everything we wanted. Our goal was to first stop the threat, or at least to delay the war, to secure 8 years to restore economic growth and create powerful armed forces." So this is former President Poroshenko saying, alright, so there's Putin, Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko there. But is it so? Has it helped Ukraine to secure itself from Russia? Actually, no. The Russian invasion has destroyed eastern Ukraine completely, and Ukraine has done nothing new in upgrading its military. They have stuck to just increasing their arsenal. Poroshenko's government was supposed to grant general amnesty to the rebels and extensive autonomy for the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Ukrainian troops were supposed to take control of the rebel-held areas after Kiev granted them representation and otherwise reintegrated them as part of Ukraine. Nothing of this ever took place. So Ukrainian troops were supposed to assimilate eastern Ukraine. It was all supposed to be demilitarized. The lines were supposed to be demarcated. Undemarcated. Demarcation, that's the word I was thinking of. and there was meant to be full devolved autonomy to those regions. It never happened. And of course I quoted up here, if the armed forces of Ukraine receives an order to withdraw heavy weapons and artillery, right sector volunteer corps reserves the right to continue military actions in accordance with its own operative plans until complete liberation of Ukrainian territories. And where was I? That would have been here. Yep. Now Russia's back in Donbass and Lugansk to grant them independence, and Ukraine is in shudders, so the Minsk agreement never helped Ukraine. It may seem absurd, but a country led by a comedian will not be able to defeat Russia in a war. Also, not just led by a comedian, led by an actor who named his political party after a fucking TV show. Servant of the People. Can't believe it. You can't make it up. And also, the TV show was broadcasted on a channel owned by an oligarch billionaire that also funded neo-Nazi militias and founded neo-Nazi militias to go into Donbass. The truth is, Ukraine made a mistake, therefore opting for a ceasefire was Ukraine's most pro-Russian step. And this was in June 2022. And then down here, in February 2023, Zelensky came out and said, but as for Minsk on the whole, because that was a former president, Petroshenko, now the current president. As for Minsk as a whole, I told Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel we cannot implement it like this, to which they responded, if we'd known beforehand that you would change the meaning of our meeting, then there would have been problems even before the summit. And here is the screenshot. Zelensky takes credit for derailing Minsk agreements. The Ukrainian president claimed he personally refused to implement the deal for peace in Donbass. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky personally refused to implement the 2015 Minsk agreements, a roadmap for peace in the east of the country which was co-sponsored by Germany and France. He made the interview during an interview with Der Spiegel, published on Thursday, as he continues his tour across Europe. Zelensky said he viewed the agreements as a concession on Ukraine's part. Of course, that's what all agreements are. You make concessions. Both parties make concessions to meet in the middle and have an agreement that both people, even if they're not happy with it, that they can live with, to avoid worse consequences, to guarantee the avoidance of worse consequences for either party. Fuck's sake. And never once actually sought to implement them. Instead, they were merely used to exchange prisoners with the two breakaway Donbass republics. The president claimed he openly told to then German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron and Russian President Vladimir Putin back in 2019, with all of them acting surprised. They were all surprised. And that says a lot. That means that the three of them, at least in 2019, did not expect this. I can believe that Putin would have been surprised, because the whole time I think he's just been surprised by how fucked Ukraine is, how in the hands of the Americans Ukraine is. But as for Minsk as a whole, blah, blah, blah. The Minsk agreements, originally broken in 2014 and further expanded in 2015, envisioned a roadmap for reconciliation between Ukraine and the Donbass republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. The two regions rebelled against the country's new authorities in the aftermath of the 2014 Maidan coup in Kiev, which ousted democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych. Ukraine's failure to implement the agreement, which would have seen the breakaway territories reintegrated within the country but retain a special status, ultimately led to the ongoing conflict. Since the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, multiple politicians have taken credit for the failure of the Minsk agreements, admitting that they were merely used as a ruse to give Ukraine time to build up its military. Former Ukrainian President Pyotr Poroshenko was the first to admit last year that Kiev never intended to abide by them, and used the deal to create powerful armed forces. Merkel and another original signatory of the Minsk agreements, former French President François Hollande, have also since confirmed that this was actually the true goal of the deal. Moscow considers these admissions to be evidence that the negotiations were conducted in bad faith and that the Ukrainian government and its backers had always intended for the Minsk agreements to flop and for the Donbass crisis to be resolved by force. Russia claims that its military campaign in Ukraine, launched last February, preempted an offensive planned by Kiev with NATO's help. Ukraine, Germany and France lied to the people of Donbass as they had a terrible fate planned for them, which Russia prevented, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said back in January. Germany, France and Ukraine were playing a swindle game with the Minsk agreements. Now is payback time, he stated at the time. Russia's Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in their first face-to-face meeting, took part in 9 hours of talks in Paris on Monday the 9th of December, brokered by French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And what's this one got again? Oh yeah, this is the Steinmeier formula. Normandy summit upholds Steinmeier formula for eastern Ukraine. This was another attempt at a peace resolution. Russia's Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in their first face-to-face meeting took part in 9 hours of talks in Paris on Monday the 9th of December, brokered by Macron and Merkel. Killed more than 13,000 people, left a large swath of Ukraine de facto controlled by Moscow-backed separatists, and aggravated the deepest East-West rift since the Cold War. Comedian turned politician, elected on a promise to resolve the conflict. There was no handshake and they avoided eye contact. Did deliver commitments. The so-called Steinmeier formula, named after its author, former foreign minister, who's now the president of Germany, is mentioned in the final communique, which says that it should be integrated into Ukraine's legislation. Calls for elections to be held in the separatist-held territories under Ukrainian legislation and the supervision of the OSCE. If the OSCE judges the ballot to be free and fair, then special self-governance status for the territories will be initiated and Ukraine will be returned control of its easternmost border. Zelensky said he agreed. According to him, it provides the approval in Ukraine of a temporary law and a special status for Donbass, which will be permanent if the OSCE recognises local elections in these territories as democratic. Reportedly, the US is pushing for sequencing under which Ukraine will gain control over its Russia border before elections in Donbass are held. Reportedly, France and Germany don't see such a necessity. The pro-Western opposition in Ukraine interprets the Steinmeier formula as capitulation and state treason. Many in Ukraine think that Zelensky, a former comedian, can be easily manipulated by Putin. So this was another attempt at peace, and it failed likewise. No to capitulation was a series of protests in Ukraine against the policy of President of Ukraine Zelensky in Ukraine. Protesters considered implementation of the Minsk agreements through the Steinmeier formula to be capitulation to Russia in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Andrei Bilyetsky, the proudly fascist Azov battalion leader who once pledged to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against Semite-led Untermenschen, vowed to bring thousands of fighters to Zolot if Zelensky pressed any further. Meanwhile, a parliamentarian from the party of former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko openly fantasized about Zelensky being blown to bits by a militant's grenade. Though Zelensky achieved a minor disengagement, the neo-Nazi paramilitaries escalated their no-capitulation campaign, and within months, fighting began to heat up again in Zolot, sparking a new cycle of violations of the Minsk agreement. By this point, Azov had been formally incorporated into the Ukrainian military, and its street vigilante wing known as the National Corps was deployed across the country under the watch of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry and alongside the National Police, who are also full of Nazis and Banderites. In December 2021, Zelensky would be seen delivering a Hero of Ukraine award to a leader of the fascistic right sector in a ceremony in Ukraine's parliament. Is that Dmytro Yarosh? Because of course they also bestowed a Hero of Ukraine medal upon Stepan Bandera, who was the leader of the OUNB who collaborated with Nazis and facilitated the ethnic cleansing of 100,000 Poles, including Jews. And then of course the quote by Peskov that really sums everything up. But that's just in the lead up to February 2022. We've also had even more duplicitousness from the West. Further to that, after the actual outbreak of war in 2022, the Minsk attempts to prevent have now failed. Peace deals were stalled and torpedoed by the West. Bennett, so this is the former Israeli PM. I'll say this in the broad sense. I think there was a legitimate decision by the West to keep smashing Putin and not... What does it mean, smashing Putin? Putin was smashing Ukraine. Hold on, yes, but given, the more aggressive approach, I'll tell you something. I can't say if they were wrong. My position at the time in this regard, it's not a national Israeli interest. It's not a national Israeli interest. Anything I did was coordinated down to the last detail with the US, Germany and France. So they broke off negotiations? Basically, yes. They broke off negotiations and I thought they were wrong. In retrospect, it's too soon to know. So this is a link from Responsible Statecraft, Diplomacy Watch, Russia and Ukraine, wait a minute. Diplomacy Watch, did Boris Johnson help stop a peace deal in Ukraine? A recent Peace and Foreign Affairs revealed that Kiev and Moscow may have had a tentative deal to end the war all the way back in April. So after only 2 months, so I think this was before the Battle of Mariupol, which was really bloody, well before the Battle of Bakhmut really began. So before all the bloodbath meat grinders really churned through a lot of human life. April. Russia and Ukraine may have agreed on a tentative deal to end the war in April. According to a recent Peace and Foreign Affairs, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appear to have tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement, wrote Fiona Hill and Angela Stent. Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23 when it controlled part of the Donbas region and all of Crimea, and in exchange Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. The news highlights the impact of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's efforts to stop negotiations, and Boris Johnson is a fucking arsehole. As journalist Branko Markitic noted on Twitter, the decision to scuttle the deal coincided with Johnson's April visit to Kiev, during which he reportedly urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to break off talks with Russia for 2 key reasons. Putin cannot be negotiated with, and the West isn't ready for the war to end. The West isn't ready for the war to end. The apparent revelation raises some key questions. Why did Western leaders want to stop Kiev from signing a seemingly good deal with Moscow? Do they consider the conflict a proxy war with Russia? Yeah, exactly, it's none of their business. Why the fuck should the West have any say whatsoever in whether Ukraine remains in a war? That is repulsive. All this talk about sovereign state, because that's one of these crutch words that these fucking idiots always bring up. Sovereign, sovereign, sovereign. Also unprovoked, unprovoked, unprovoked. Also Kremlin, Kremlin, Kremlin. And Putin, Putin, Putin. Sovereign. This just shows that a country that can be told when to stop and start wars is not sovereign. What the fuck? For now, we can only speculate. Like, Boris Johnson would have been a little fucking messenger bird taking a note from Washington when he did that. For now, we can only speculate about the answers to the first 2 questions. The third is perhaps no less challenging, especially given the fact that both Ukraine and Russia have, at least publicly, hardened their negotiating positions significantly in recent months. But there are some clues that could help us answer it. Of course, another aspect is that Russia's been forced to mobilise and endure a whole year of war that it didn't want. Russia has been forced to start a war economy, like it's actually ramping up and getting ready for a protracted war. Anytime you do that to a country, there's going to be consequences. You're going to weaken the amount of bargaining that you can do from your side if you force that upon the other side when it was needless. One possible path back to a peace deal is to build on July's grain agreement, in which Kiev and Moscow agreed to restart wheat exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. The deal has held strong despite continued hostilities, allowing more than 1 million metric tons of grain to enter the world market so far. This accord shows that each side is at least interested in reducing the global impact of the war. And then it gets into the nuclear issue. More sanctioning. Russia retaliating. And then Macron said to AP, Associated Press, Macron argued that Europe must get prepared for a long war in order to put Ukraine in the best possible position for negotiations. What completely destroyed. He also defended his decision to keep talking with Putin, keep bullshitting Putin and hoping that you can get away with it, arguing that we must do everything to make a negotiated peace possible. Bit late for that. They mobilised and they're going to mobilise again and again and again. And as the West keeps sending in tanks and aircraft, which are anticipated to be getting sent in, Russia is going to have more and more work to do, because it's going to have to not just demilitarise and denazify Ukraine, which was the original objective. It's going to mission creep over to having to demilitarise and denazify the whole of the world, for fuck's sake. China's going to have to get involved as well. As soon as it seems like Russia's losing, China's going to have to openly back Russia as well. In a Tuesday press briefing, spokesperson Vedant Patel responded to concerns that the US weapon transfers to Ukraine have dropped Pentagon weapon stockpiles to uncomfortably low levels. So it looks like the Russian new mission to denazify the whole of the West is well underway. And of course, what's his name? Stoltenberg just recently announced that NATO's supplies of ammunition, especially artillery, are dangerously low, and that the rate of consumption of Ukraine against Russia, so the rate of consumption of all of these countries and NATO and anyone else that chipped in, all in together, is less than the Ukrainian rate of consumption. That just shows that the paper tiger is the West. The real paper tiger is not Russia. It's very, very evidently the West. That has been well evinced by the past year. So next one is this, because we're still on the subject of Bennett. Bennett says the US and its Western allies decided to keep striking Putin and not negotiate. I'm going to watch a video of this. I flew to Germany because Germany and France are the main figures in Europe, and in order to reach an agreement, everyone should make an effort. I was making protocols of what happened after talking with Putin. He's saying what he did. I'll give some audio a little bit. I read that fast. In the next steps, what disagreements arose during the negotiations and what is required of everyone. There in Berlin, we're bringing the Americans, Jake Sullivan, sometimes Blinken, sometimes Biden and Macron up to date, and Boris Johnson. Each leader has his own approach. You can divide the leaders into those who adhere to the line, we must fight back against Putin, and those who say there are losers in any war. So Boris Johnson advocated more radical measures, and Macron and Schultz are more pragmatic, let's say, and Biden supported both approaches, so Biden tried to be in the middle. But the West has decided that it is necessary to continue to smash Putin. So there's the hawks, and then there's the doves, and then there's Biden in the middle, who's the real fucking hawk, I think. Boris Johnson is a fucking idiot. No one gives a shit what he says, he's a fucking idiot. And not to negotiate. All my actions were coordinated to the smallest detail with the USA, Germany and France. And they broke off the negotiations, this guy asks, and then he says yes. They broke off the negotiations, and it seemed to me that they were wrong. I'm sure we had a good chance of success if they hadn't stopped trying. So there was a good chance of negotiations resulting in peace, and they were broken off, and he attributes that to Boris Johnson. But I don't know, I think Boris Johnson's a fucking idiot. I think everyone realises he's a fucking idiot. I think Biden maybe wanted Boris Johnson to take the fall. Maybe he's getting paid to do that. Maybe the deep state in fucking America or Biden have made Boris Johnson be the hawk, so that there's a hawk side that Biden can sit in the middle of and then just sort of inch towards whenever he needs to keep the war going. I don't think the idea that Boris Johnson would be leading fucking anything, any kind of a wing of any debate, is just absurd. He's just a fucking clown. People perceive Boris Johnson here like people perceived Trump in America when Trump was at his most clownish. The other concession Russia made, according to Bennett, is that it wouldn't seek the disarmament of Ukraine. For the Ukrainian side, Zelensky announced that he would seek no membership, which Bennett said was the reason for Russia's invasion. So Bennett is convinced that the reason was Ukrainian flirting with NATO, which of course that is the primary reason. On its own, it isn't much of a problem. Ukraine being a vassal of the US and having all of these neo-Nazis that hate Russia is a problem, but not much of a problem on its own, because other countries have that, like Estonia and Latvia. They have a lot of fucking neo-Nazis that hate Russia. But it's only when it's a big enough country and the US is backing it as a proxy and the country's government itself is completely puppeted by the US that it all combines to create a time bomb. And it's clear that over here in the West, it's clear to me that the Russians feared that Ukraine was going to just have an army and attack Russia or attack Donbass with the army, which it's been building for 8 years. And as was described earlier by Macron and Hollande and Merkel. Discussing how Western leaders felt about his mediation efforts, Bennett said then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson took an aggressive line while French President Macron and Scholz were more pragmatic. Biden adopted both positions. That's definitely important there. He's at least somewhat siding with Boris Johnson. That's really bad. He is either actually being influenced by Boris Johnson like that or is pretending to be. Boris Johnson doing that, I think, is just there to shift the averting window in Biden's favour to be more aggressive. Explaining his decision to mediate, Bennett said that it was in Israel's national interest not to pick a side in the war, citing Israel's frequent airstrikes in Syria. Bennett said Russia has S-300 air defences in Syria and that if they press the button, Israeli pilots will fall. And that's it. No, wait. Here is some pushback to this. So this is the more mainstream reporting of this. No, Elon, the US didn't scuttle a Ukraine peace deal. Twitter contrarians given the spotlight by Elon Musk distort an interview by Israel's ex-PM. Don't know how you distort that, the words are straight from his mouth. It's not like any additional context can change the meaning. Like, what context can you put around those statements to alter their meaning by even one bit? As the anniversary of Vladimir Putin's Ukraine invasion nears, the narrative blaming Western leaders for the war's continuation. Of course, they haven't mentioned any of this. No, wait. Any of this in this article, which is convenient. They can only isolate tiny pieces of problems and then try and find a way to minimise or excuse it. But there's mountains of this and it all looks absolutely damning for the West, and it somewhat vindicates the Russian position and exonerates them, so that's why they don't cover it. The most they'll do is take a little thing like this and do their best to make it look better than it actually is. So, usual suspects weighed in, complete with the requisite one-word concern trolling from Twitter CEO Elon Musk. Concerning. Among those who shared Tracy's tweet, Thomas Massey, the Republican congressman from Kentucky. So there's one of the Republicans that are against this war, it seems like. There's only one problem. Bennett didn't actually say what Mattei and his Amen chorus claimed he said. In fact, when Mattei posted a 2-minute video clip condensed from the Bennett interview, the Russia-Ukraine portion of which is over half an hour long and starts in about 2.5 hours in, the tweet soon had a community note appended to it, providing some helpful context, including the fact that the video clip was deceptively cut. Here's what Bennett said, who worked on mediating a Russia-Ukraine settlement last March with the United States, France, Germany and Britain involved in the talks, actually said. I'm relying both on the subtitles provided by Bennett's channel and on an English auto-translate from Hebrew. So he doesn't even know the language, alright, and he's trying to do a refutation. We can divide the spectrum of leaders who's tending more towards now we have to fight Putin because we mustn't reward the bad guys, right, and who says forget war, everyone loses, right. Boris Johnson adopted the aggressive line. Macron and Scholz were more pragmatic and Biden was both. I'll say this in the broad sense, I think there was a legitimate decision by the West to keep smashing Putin and not. What does it mean, smashing Putin? Putin was smashing Ukraine. Hold on, yes, but given, the more aggressive approach, I'll tell you something. I can't say if they were wrong. My position at the time, in this regard, it's not a national Israeli interest. Anything I did was coordinated down to the last detail with the US, Germany and France. So they broke off negotiations? Basically, yes. They broke off negotiations and I thought they were wrong. In retrospect, it's too soon to know. Here, there are some translation discrepancies. The English subtitles from Bennett's translator say they blocked it, while the Russian subtitles in English auto-translate say they broke off negotiations. The downside of the war going on is the casualties in Ukraine and Russia. It's a very harsh blow to Ukraine, the country. There will have to be a huge restoration of infrastructure like the Marshall Plan. The negative impact on the export of wheat and food to the Middle East, although that was partially taken care of. The rise in energy costs, which puts heavy pressure on the democracies. On the other hand, I'm not being cynical. There's a statement here after very many years. President Biden created an alliance vis-a-vis an aggressor in the general perception, and this reflects on other areas such as China, Taiwan, and their consequences, so it's too soon to know. I have one claim. I claim there was a good chance of reaching a ceasefire. It's getting worse the more it gets elaborated on. Holy shit, they're trying to make it look better and it looks worse. Had they not curbed it. But I'm not sure, but I'm not claiming it was the right thing. In real time, I thought the right thing was a ceasefire, now I can't say. maybe it would have conveyed the wrong message to other countries. Statesmanship is very complex, and there are things I don't want to go into, which why it was the right thing or not. My God, slightly early in the interview, about 2 hours and 45 minutes, Bennett makes another significant statement. While the talks achieved some breakthroughs, with Putin agreeing to drop his demands for Ukraine's demilitarization and denazification, which Bennett understood to mean the removal of Volodymyr Zelensky as president of Ukraine, and Zelensky agreeing to drop the goal of NATO membership, all of that jittered to a halt in early April once the reports came in of Russian atrocities in Bucha, the town near Kiev that had been under Russian occupation in March. As Bennett succinctly puts it, the Bucha massacre, once that happened, I said it's over. So, that's another... I always thought it was just a interesting thing to note how much this word resembles butcher in English. Always thought that was very conspicuous. In other words, it wasn't the United States or Western countries or NATO that ended any peace talks such as they were. Rather, it was first and foremost Russia's bloody escalation of the violence. So they say here, as they put it. One can certainly wish Bennett had been clear in his interview about who ended the negotiations and how it seems unlikely that they refers only to the United States, since elsewhere in the interview Bennett depicts the Biden administration as occupying the middle ground between the hawks and the doves, and suggests that Boris Johnson was the only hawk. Bennett did, however, provide some clarification on Twitter in response to another thread amplifying Mate's revelations. 2 points worth emphasising, I speak about it here. It's unsure there was any deal to be made. At the time I gave it roughly a 50% chance. Americans felt chances were way lower. Well, that's very telling, goddamn. Hard to tell who is right. It is worth noting that most of what Bennett says in his interview has been reported before. Yep. Was alerted to this new foreign affairs piece by Alex Jordan, where Fiona Hill accidentally let slip a key fact. Russia and Ukraine agreed to a tentative settlement in April that would have halted the war. Of course, Hill doesn't mention UK PM flew to Kiev instantly to scuttle it. Well, I think all in, you can see the way things actually are, and you can see what fits with the reality and what doesn't. So I don't think these minimisation pieces by these MSM outlets... What the fuck is the Bulwark anyway? What is this fucking absolute rag? American neoconservative news and opinion website. Yeah. So the websites that are even willing to cover this, which is not many, whenever they're going to talk about it, they just make it look worse. Like, there's a whole article here dedicated to apparently reversing what is quite clearly apparent, and it only manages to do that all the way down here when it says this, which I don't believe. I think the whole point in peace is to avoid this. And that's what they were actually pursuing, peace. So I don't buy it. What might have happened is that they could have been nearing a peace deal, and then suddenly it just happens to be a coincidence that this appears in the media, and then the peace deals are over. Doesn't that seem like a credible hypothesis? Peace is getting close, and then the whole of the Western mainstream media, which is of course funded by the War Department during times of war, because these are all owned by the state because they're not viable on their own as commercial ventures, so they get subsidised by governments. During times of war, they're entirely subsumed by the War Department, and they print all of this. And Western perception changes as a result, as it is intended to, and then appetite for peace decreases, and appetite for ongoing war is restored. And politicians know that the appetite for the war is there. So yeah, that's where it is to me. It seems like it's just about maintaining an appetite for war. That's what I've always thought from the very beginning when I first saw this being reported on in the mainstream media. I just smelled pure warmongering. And indeed, that's what I started out this playlist with almost a year ago now. and all I've ever seen since is more of the same. In addition to already having had context of the past decade of Ukraine to clue me in and see right through it, see it for exactly what it is.